The poem The Red Wheelbarrow by the American poet William Carlos Williams is very short. It's just 4 couplets long. It goes, "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens." And that's it. There's no punctuation really. It doesn't seem to have much meaning. And yet countless students are exposed to this poem. It's touted as one of the great modernist poems, and people wonder, what's up with this poem? What is it about? And some people seem to treat it as something that needs extensive analysis. That's why I have this little pie chart on the right, as if we can analytically explain everything in this poem, make some sense of it, and get to the deeper meaning. And part of what I want to do in this video is just take a step back and reconsider all of this kind of enterprise. Is there a deeper meaning? Is there something that's hidden below the surface of the text? Or is this more a poem that's asking some questions about interpretation? And I think the latter is actually the case. I don't think you should read too much into this poem. You shouldn't go overboard and say, well, what is this poem about? And there must be something deeper that I don't see right away. Instead, it's better to zoom way out and to think about the whole modernist time period and what artists were doing at the time. And then I think you can get a more accurate picture as to what this poem is really about. Now, before we start here, I should give one example of the kind of ludicrous interpretation I've seen of this poem, The Red Wheelbarrow. I once had a student write about this on an exam, and the student suggested that this poem is clearly about Canadian agriculture. This is a Canadian classroom, but you can kind of see how the student was forced to write something, right? What is this about? Well, there's the color red. That's clearly in the Canadian flag, and the rest must be some kind of comment about living on a farm. Of course, the poet himself was American, but, we can just ignore that. You see there the kind of struggle that students have with this. What do we do with such a short little poem? And part of that has to do with what happens in schools, right? When we talk about poems, we have the sense that, well, there must be some deeper meaning. And we also have this belief that you can make up the meaning yourself, that there's this subjectivity that allows you as a reader to make up your meaning because all meaning is relative. And that's also something to guard against here. You can't just go overboard and read anything into this poem. All right, that was kind of a long introduction here. But I think if we zoom out now and think a little bit about what William Carlos Williams was doing, then the poem will start to make a little bit more sense. If we go to the period before this poem was written, so this is before 1923, two of the kind of popular movements in art during this time were what's called Imagism, and Imagism is a movement in poetry, and the other movement is called Cubism. And if we talk about these movements and what they stood for, I think the poem will come into focus a little bit here. So, first of all, if we think about Imagism, Imagism was a movement that was very popular, especially between kind of 1914 and 1917. That was the heyday of Imagism. And poets like Ezra Pound, the famous American poet, poets like Ezra Pound were saying that poetry had to return to the basics. What the poet should focus on is the crispness of an image. A poem should be direct. It shouldn't be artificial. It shouldn't be sentimental. So in fact, sometimes it's easier to define Imagism by what it's not. And what it reacted against very much was the sense of sentimentality. So not sentimental, not overly symbolic. Okay. There was a kind of attempted honesty in returning to basic principles. And if you zoom out even more and you think about modernism, which is really the kind of movement that stands behind these artistic movements like Imagism and Cubism, then modernism is typically that return to first principles. Modernism is an attempt to purify art, to get rid of all the external stuff, and to return to the core kind of qualities of what art is. Now, in the process of purifying art, a lot of the past, a lot of tradition gets sacrificed, gets destroyed, and there's this way in which modernism is both destruction and rebuilding. If you want a kind of comparison of what the Imagism Imagist poets were reacting against, if you want a contrast, you might look at something like the Romantics. So the Romantic poets were very much about going into nature, and when you enter into nature, you want to have this rich emotional experience. You can think of somebody like Wordsworth or Coleridge or Shelley or Keats, and you want nature to do something to you. Okay, maybe you want to have a sublime experience. Whatever it is, it should be something powerful. Imagism is almost the opposite. It kind of says, well, let's take that subjective element and change it. It's not like we're totally against the subjective, but we want to return to images that are crisp, that are not filled with all kinds of overly emotional content. We just want to see nature for what it is. There's almost a kind of scientific aspect to this as well, the sense of seeing clearly, seeing objectively, and not being distracted by some of these other things that make the poem, as Images said, sloppy. Okay, not sentimental and sloppy. All right. If you look at the world of painting, Cubism is a kind of analogous kind of expression of some of these ideas. And I have one image of a Cubist painting here. This is Pablo Picasso's painting, The Three Musicians, from 1921. And that's, of course, just 2 years before our poem. Now, Picasso, what he and various other Cubist painters were trying to do is they were trying to change our sense of perspective. So traditionally, in a painting, what we have is we have one central perspective. Okay, if the canvas is here and I'm seeing some kind of picture behind it that I, try to put on my painting, there we go, and this is me, then I'm looking in one direction, right? And I don't see the same thing from multiple angles. But what if we saw reality differently? What if, again, we distrusted that kind of copying of nature and felt that was not totally honest? What if we said we should look at this picture actually from multiple angles at the same time, right? That's actually more scientific if we think about it. There might be multiple spectators who see the same object, in this case, let's say a tree, and all of these people are going to have different perspectives. Well, that's going to lead to a kind of fragmentary reality. Okay, a fragmentary kind of reality. And that's what Cubism is. As the painter Paul Cézanne said, and he very much inspired the Cubists, what painters should focus on is what he said are the kind of spheres, the shapes that are part of nature. He talked about how nature should be expressed through the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone, as Paul Cézanne famously said. What he meant by that then is that don't just treat nature as if it's a given, right? As people, we reconstruct nature. We use our minds. We use our subjectivity. And we have to be more honest about that. And that leads to this kind of weird fragmentary reality. Now, sometimes these art forms like Cubism are hard to explain. Why did this happen? Why did somebody suddenly say, hey, we should look at the same thing from multiple angles. We should fragment things. We should distort things. Why are we doing this? And that bigger picture is indeed very difficult to explain. But if we go back to our poem now, notice we've hardly talked about our poem yet, we can see that what is really behind it, I think, is simply an attempt to be honest. Modernism is again that kind of cleansing, that attempt to clear the desk and to start over. That's why you have these paintings that are sometimes just, one color. Or you have somebody saying, well, why can't we have a urinal in an exhibition? As Marcel Duchamp famously said, it's just an object. I just found it, but it can be part of the show. What is art, right? These are the basic questions as we start over and think about what art actually is. Now that's exactly what William Carlos Williams is doing in this poem too. He's simply saying, look, there are these objects, right? There's a red wheelbarrow, there's rainwater, there are some white chickens, and a lot depends upon that. But I'm not going to tell you exactly what depends upon it. I'm not going to interpret it for you. I'm not going to tell you what my emotions are about it. In many ways, this is a poem that refuses interpretation. It's a poem that says, do we really need to interpret this in great detail? You can enjoy it if you want, right? There are a bunch of objects here, there are a bunch of things, there's some kind of relationship between them. And these things are important, they're beautiful, but it's up to you. It's up to you as a viewer to make some sense of this. And then you can read all kinds of things into it if you want. But the poem itself doesn't give you that interpretation. You bring that to the poem. Okay? And that's what makes this poem very much like that kind of cubist experimenting that you see in Picasso. Although here it's more focused on nature, and it's kind of saying, well, let's revisit Romanticism, let's change the conversation, and let's focus on the crispness of the images and find beauty in that. So William Carlos Williams, as an American poet, was trying to do something new in giving voice to a kind of American landscape, American rhythms of speech, and he was willing to simplify, to start over, and to find the beauty in that. And I think if you appreciate that, and you can talk about that context that makes the poem, then you don't have to worry about over-interpreting it and feel that you're just reading things into the poem. So hopefully that helps a little bit and allows you to make sense of the poem.